Today's story will probably give you a heap of mixed feelings. It is a scary story for sure, and it's clear from the commentary that the general takeaway we're supposed to have is fear. But it's also extremely tragic, and were it not for the scarier aspects, this might even be one of the most moving stories I will ever tell on this channel. Yokoso owashitare, and welcome back to another classical Japanese folktale. And if you like Japanese history and culture, or you just like storytelling in general, please don't forget to give the video a like and subscribe to the channel because there are plenty more of these stories where this one came from. And with all of that out of the way, let's just get into the story because I think this is a good one. Let's just go for it. Once upon a time, imawa mukashi, there was in the capital a young nama samurai. Now, nama samurai is a combination of the words nama and samurai. Nama can mean a lot of things, but here it means something to the effect of like young or inexperienced. While the word samurai, which as mentioned in previous videos, at this time in Japanese history was not synonymous with warrior. It meant something more like servant, and denoted a member of the lower or middle nobility that served a member of the upper nobility. Now, this young samurai was very poor, at least relative to the rest of the nobility, and he had spent the past several years flitting from job to job with no consistently reliable work to help lift him out of this very sorry state. But one way or another, he always managed to keep himself from completely drowning in his poverty, and by hook or by crook, he continued chugging along the railroad of life. That is, however, until a certain man, whose name is missing in the actual original manuscript, was made the governor of an unnamed province. This, it turns out, was a very good stroke of fortune for our main man here, because it just so happened that he was very well acquainted with this newly appointed governor, and as soon as he was given the job, the governor came to this young man with an offer that promised to fix all of his woes. "My friend," he said to the young samurai, "as much as we all wish to live in the capital, instead of wasting away here with no real prospects, how about you come out to the provinces and work under me? Given my new position, I would be able to see to it that all of your needs are met, and I myself have spent many years unable to secure my aims and know what it's like to struggle. But now that I've finally been able to achieve a worthwhile position, I would like to pass on the good fortune to others who could use some help. What do you say to that?" Now, I don't think I need to explain to most of you how happy and grateful this young man was. I'm sure most of us have been in, or currently are, in fairly dire financial straits and can imagine how amazing it would be if a friend of ours suddenly made it big and then reached out a helping hand to give us a job that meant that we basically didn't have to worry about material necessities ever again. Working under a governor would not only be useful, because it's just a good job, but then, even after the governor's term was finished, the experience gained working such a job would easily transfer to other positions. Even if it wasn't forever under the same guy, though it definitely could be, this young man was basically set. While he would still just remain in the lower or middle ranks of nobility, he likely would never be without a job or support for the rest of his days. There was no way he could refuse. So, thanking this new governor profusely for his generosity, the samurai was then told that he needed to prepare immediately to set out for the provinces. There was no time to lose. And he did just that, practically bursting at the seams with giddiness and gratitude as he went home to pack his things. However, there was just one problem. This young man had a wife, and this complicated things. And here I need to explain how marriage and courtship work at the time because it's actually very relevant for those of you who are new to these kinds of stories. In Heian times, they had something akin to modern marriage where a man and a woman would commit to each other in an official sense, but it wasn't nearly as defined of a relationship as marriages are today. Usually, it happened after a man visited a woman several times in the night, as men were typically on the move while women stayed in one place, and after successfully visiting a woman a few times, which meant that the woman and or her parents with whom she usually lived also sanctioned this relationship, there was a small, very inconspicuous ceremony involving some small rice cakes that demonstrated that the man was making this woman his wife and intended to support her and her family politically, financially, etc. However, While a man typically only had one official wife, one main wife, he could and often did have multiple other women that he would visit and commit to insofar as he could get the women to agree to it and also had the means to support them. Now, this means that visiting other women was not cheating in the modern sense, as it was a very standard practice of the time, albeit one that the majority of women typically didn't like, if the tale of Genji is to be believed at least. But it was normal, open, and accepted by society at large, sometimes even encouraged. Now, marriages at the time especially weren't just about two lovers agreeing to share their lives together. They also had financial, reputational, and other societal reasons behind them. Husbands would support their wives and their families financially, represent them at court if they were going to court, and in exchange, the wives and their families would provide the man with posterity and a place to stay, as well as possibly helping him out financially should the need arise. And if either party wanted a divorce, the woman could either refuse to let the man into her premises or move somewhere else, or the man could just stop showing up. There were no real official proceedings for a divorce, just as there were no real papers signed or anything conspicuous for when a man and a woman got married. It was much less formalized than our concept of marriage today. So this young man, who had just accepted a job offer out in the countryside, far, far away from the capital, had a wife who lived there in the city. Now, she too was relatively poor. Again, both of them were members of the nobility, so they were poor by aristocratic standards, and she had very little material backing. However, aside from her being down on her luck, she was practically the perfect wife. She was young and very good looking, and she had the sweetest, most endearing personality you could ever find. Not once had she ever complained about her husband's low station or lack of means, nor did she care so much about how bad she had it as long as they had each other. And they did have each other. There was genuine love between these two. The exact phrasing in the text is tagai ni, or maybe katami ni, tagai ni sarigataku omoe wa tarikeru, which meant something like they found it hard to part from each other. So basically what I'm getting at is there was genuine affection between these two. This wasn't a marriage of convenience or anything like that. This wasn't mercenary. There was genuine feeling between these two. But here, the man had to make a choice. As nice as his wife was, her lack of means could theoretically potentially hamper the gains he could make with this new job. And since he could really only afford to take one woman with him, and that it would benefit him significantly to make a good impression by being with a woman of appropriate financial means, he stopped coming around his first wife's place and instead found a new woman with better financial backing, whom he was probably only able to marry because of this new job, and took this second woman out to the provinces with him. Now, I couldn't tell you the details of how it all worked or why it would be that important for him to take a better propertied woman with him instead of his first wife. I'm guessing, as I mentioned before, it was an attempt to maximize the gains he would make with this new job, but it's also possible that in order to even make it out to the new place, he needed someone to pay for his new lease on life to get all of that started. It's also possible that, he was just a young, stupid jackwagon who didn't understand how wonderful a truly good woman was, but whatever his reasons, at the end of the day, he stopped visiting his first wife, which was basically divorce, and left for the provinces with a new one. And of course, by and by, he arrived out in the provinces, safe and sound. He immediately got to work, and over the course of his time away from the capital, he was able to make some very, very good material gains. At long last, after years and years of barely scraping by at the bottom, he was no longer poor. But as the days out in the provinces turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, this man couldn't completely shake the feelings he had for his first wife. At first, it wasn't really much of a problem. The excitement of all of the good new stuff was enough to distract him. But as more and more time passed, his longing for his first wife grew alongside his regret. Sure, the wealth that he had gained was nice, but can material goods make up for a good woman's genuine love? She had been there for him for years, never bemoaning his lack of funds, never asking anything more than just his affection, and he had just tossed all of that aside in pursuit of a handful of nice things. His sense of longing and guilt only grew as time passed until he was dying to go back to the capital and see her again. But he was stuck out in the provinces until the governor's term was up, which could be anywhere between 4 and 6 years, which he was now destined to spend in misery. But of course, time doesn't stand still, and eventually the governor's term did come to an end, and he and everyone who came out with him eventually made their way back to the capital. Now, of course, the young samurai had been waiting anxiously for this moment, and as soon as it arrived, he immediately sent his second wife back to her parents' house, which was basically him divorcing her, and cursing himself for abandoning his first wife for such a stupid reason, he vowed to himself that he would march straight over to her house, take up residence there, and never, ever leave her again. He was so anxious to see her that once he actually made it back into the city, instead of finding somewhere to change out of his travel clothes and make himself presentable like most people would have done, he headed straight there before doing literally anything else. He couldn't bear being away from her for even a moment more than was necessary. Now, it was dark when he arrived at the house, and he found the gate to the estate wide open with no one guarding it. That wasn't a good sign. Shouldn't it at least be locked or someone watching it? He was already anxious about seeing her again after so many years. I mean, he had no idea what she would do or say, but seeing the gate not properly attended to meant that something was off. He nervously crossed the threshold and beheld the place for the first time in several years. It was a mess. It didn't look anything like it had when he left. The house itself was breaking down with the garden growing out of control, and there wasn't a single sign that anyone lived there at all. What happened here? Fearing that maybe he was too late and she and the other people of the house had abandoned it, his heart ached as he looked at the lonely wreckage of what remained. He wondered if maybe the little bit of emotional support he had given them, and maybe possibly a little bit of financial support he had given them, was enough to keep his wife and her people willing to put up with the unfortunate circumstances, and his leaving meant that they had no motivation to keep the place up. Or maybe, after he left, she decided that she needed somebody else's support, and was whisked away to another place by a different man. He could only guess at what brought about this sorry state of affairs. Now, it was sometime in the middle of the 9th month, which would make it more like the middle of November for us, and the icy moon was shining very, very brightly, and the cold only added to the forlorn atmosphere. Eventually, the man reached the main hall, stepped up onto the veranda, and immediately made his way to the main room, the place where he had spent so many nights with his love. He didn't know if he was ready to see it in disrepair, like the rest of the house, and he had by now basically accepted that everybody was gone. But after crossing into the aisle and sticking his head into the room, he saw there, in the moonlight, a pale, beautiful face with a pair of beautiful, dark, wondering eyes looking right back at him. It was his wife. She was still here, apparently completely alone, but here she was. And what's more, when he looked to her face and saw realization spread across it, there wasn't even a hint of anger or spite on it. Just a complicated mixture of relief, joy, gratitude, and a whole host of overwhelmingly positive emotions. Now, the text doesn't actually mention this, but I imagine that the first thing that this man did upon seeing the love he had pined for years is to take a couple of very big, very fast strides to where she was sitting and wrap his arms around her, which she then returned, both of them trying and very likely failing to contain a stream of very emotional tears. What the text does say, though, is that the woman eventually asked her husband, almost like she was scared to believe it, how he was even there and when he had come back. The man simply replied that the entire time he had been out in the provinces, not a day went by where he didn't regret leaving her and how he had missed her so much. He then told her that although he had brought a lot of very nice gifts back with him and intended to call some capable new servants that were now working under him to help look after her and the property, all those things which were great, those could wait for tomorrow. For now, he just wanted to be there with her and tell her everything that he had struggled with, everything that he had borne inside him for all of those years that he was away. His wife, again, had nothing but joy and gratitude on her face when she heard all of this, and soon they were happily chatting about everything that had happened over the duration of his absence. Their conversation went on effortlessly for hours. It was almost like they had never been separated in the first place. And by, the night grew old. At some point, the man suggested that they actually, lay down and try to get some sleep. And, still holding each other, they went to the south side of the building and did just that. And yet, while still laying down, their conversation continued. The samurai asked her if there were any servants left at all, to which she replied that after he had left, things at the estate had slowly become so bad that all of the servants gave up and left. I mean, servants gotta eat too, and if the lady of the house isn't capable of paying them and making sure that, they can live, then they have no choice, really. But on and on they continued talking. Yet, all the while, the man felt his love for her grow more ardent than it had ever been before. Finally, perhaps only an hour or so before the first glow in the sky, they fell asleep in each other's arms. Now, if my assumption is correct, from reading these kinds of stories and things like the Tale of Genji, most people at the time typically got up a bit before the sun actually breached the horizon. But these two, probably because they had stayed up so late just talking, had no intention of getting up at a reasonable hour. And as mentioned before, there were no servants in the house to take care of everything else around them. And probably because these two had been so busy being lovey-dovey with each other, the lattice shutters hadn't been shut properly. And at some point, the sun rose above the surrounding trees and dropped a ray of golden light right onto this man's face. Of course, this was enough to wake him. And so, annoyed and groggy, he decided, with his eyes still shut, that he should probably get up and close the shutters himself so he could get back to sleep. But when he opened his eyes, the first thing that met his sight was horrifying. There, wrapped up in his arms, and face to face with him just inches away, was a corpse that was little more than dry, withered skin stretched over lifeless bones, covered in women's clothing. The man's adrenaline surged through him, and out of pure, terrified reaction, he scrambled out of the room with as much haste as he could muster. Once he had put a bit of space between him and this dead body that apparently appeared out of nowhere and had cleared the threshold of the room, he wondered if he had really seen what he thought he had seen. Maybe he hadn't quite completely woken up from a bad dream, and maybe a combination of being half asleep, his weariness from the trip, and the sudden awakening by the sun. Maybe between all of that, his eyes had just played a trick on him and he had misseen some things. He looked back to check to make sure that he wasn't crazy, but sure enough, his eyes were not playing tricks on him. There, illuminated by the golden light of the early sun, was a lifeless, shriveled husk of a human being, the clothing that still clung to its lifeless frame looking exactly the same as what his wife had been wearing last night. Horrified, the man then turned and sprinted out of the building, leapt off of the veranda, bolted across the garden, and out of the gate. Once he was safely beyond the premises, he slowed down, and now that the initial shock had settled, he began wondering, what even was that? Was that really his wife? Had he actually been with her last night? Was it a dream? Was she really dead? Or was there some other explanation? He needed answers, but he also had zero desire to go back and examine the place and the apparent dead body. Instead, he headed for a small peasant house nearby and, feigning like he had just gotten there, saluted the man who lived there and engaged him in a friendly chat. After shooting the breeze for a bit, probably doing everything he could to keep his fear and anxiety from creeping into his speech, he asked the man from the small house, "By the way, you wouldn't happen to know where the owner of that larger house next door is, do you? The place looked deserted when I walked by it. Is there anyone there at all?" The man from the small house grew very stern and said, terrible shame that. The woman who lived there was abandoned by her husband of several years who went out to live in the provinces. She took that separation really, really hard, and it seemed like she struggled with that for years, only for it to cause her to come down with some kind of really bad sickness. By that time, though, she had lost all of her servants and had no one there to help her, and she died this last summer. People have been talking about doing right by her and disposing of her remains properly, but since she's already been there so long, everyone is too scared to actually do anything about it. So I imagine her body is still in the house somewhere. When these words met his ears, the samurai's heart dropped. She had died, and her body had been left to rot in that house for months. But if that was the case, who did he see last night? She had been there. He knew it. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that their reunion had been something unnatural. And as such, he really didn't care to think about if it had been a good or a bad thing. He wanted nothing to do with it at this point. And so, thanking this next-door neighbor for the information, the man simply left for his own house there in the capital, feeling completely scared out of his wits. And that's where the story proper ends, but we have our final comments by the writer. He does highlight how scary this whole ordeal must have been for this young man, but also makes a comment that this woman's spirit was so desperate and so devoted to her husband that even after she died, she stuck around patiently waiting his return, but also that it's almost certain that sometime over the course of the man's stay there that night, and what I say next is going to be kind of disgusting, he had connected with her in the way that lovers do. Yeah, basically, the writer is claiming that this guy probably did the deed with a reanimated dead body, or a disguised dead body that was moving, which is, according to the text itself, very, very shocking indeed. And thus, it is said that because such terrifying things can happen, a man should, at the very least, reach out to and check in on a woman he has visited regularly. So basically, please, be faithful. I'm noticing a pattern with some of these stories. Just, if you're gonna be with somebody, just commit, okay? Just be good. Like that's really it. Just be good. But that is where the story proper, that's where the text actually ends. So that is where I am going to end it as well. So if you did enjoy that story, you found it amusing, I actually found it rather, when I was reading this story, just with the way the language is, I find it actually rather stirring, the fact that this woman waited around so long and they finally had this really touching reunion. And it is kind of, because she was technically dead and a ghost, and that's like, you know, but also like, man, if it wasn't so, it would be extraordinarily touching and romantic, although she was dead. But if you did find that story amusing, please don't forget to give the video a like, and please subscribe to the channel, because there are more stories, more ghost stories. There's actually more touching, lovey stories that I actually am kind of a big fan of, despite me being a red-blooded male. I'm sorry, I like a good romance. And please share with anybody who you think might be mildly interested in Japanese culture, history, storytelling, or just somebody who needs to throw something on in the background while they do their laundry or stuck in traffic or doing other menial, pointless work. That's how I consume most of my YouTube. Anyway, with all of that being said, if you have been watching all the way up to the end here, I do thank you sincerely. Ito ureshu koso haberikere. And hopefully, we will see you next week for another story that also would be super touching if it wasn't so sad. Although this one is a little less disturbing, if I do say so myself, but it's still kind of in the same vein. But anyway, you'll just have to see when we get there. Anyways, thank you so much, guys. We'll see you later. Goodbye.